Hi and Ben, welcome to my book corner. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about Onyx Storm. This is the third book in the Empyrean Series by Rebecca Yarros. This is a romatasy series, if you have somehow managed to avoid this so far. This came out on January the 21st of this year. The hardback comes in at 527 pages, the ebook 779. I personally listened to the audiobook of this, primarily narrated by Rebecca Yarros and featuring a number of other narrators as well, and that came down to 23 hours and 52 minutes long. Worth mentioning here, as this is book 3 in a series, there will be some spoilers for books 1 and 2 in here, and I am going to have a spoiler section a little bit later on at the end to discuss some things that I don't want to talk about in the spoiler-free section. But with all that being said, as always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I hit the spoiler section, and then my final thoughts. Let's dive straight in. This picks up straight after book 2 finishes, and we had a massive change to status quo at the end of book 1. In terms of the dragons and dragon lore, we discovered that Navarre is a secret 7th breed that is not recorded within the records, and to power the ward stones to keep the venom out, or at least restrict their powers within airspace, because that's something else they discovered, they need the breath of all 7 species of dragon. The other little wrinkle of this is a dragon can only use its kind of magical essence once in its lifetime to imbue a ward stone. So what we have here is a setup for the main crux of this, which is the search for the rest of Navarre's kind of dragons. The second thing is you have another change of status quo in that the leader of Basgiath, who was Violet's mother, died at the end of Iron Flame with a noble sacrifice, so you have a new leader in Basgiath who is once again quite hostile to Violet and Xaden as well. No change there then. You also have political fallout, so you have Navarre trying to make alliances as now everybody realises that the Venom are there, that they can actually get past the wards even if they are slightly restricted. So you have a loads of other stuff going on here, and you still have the looming spectre of the Sage character, and then another character that appears quite early on with the reoccurring dreams that have appeared within books 1 and 2 continuing in this one. So the basic premise is then you have a quest to find the hidden MacGuffin, or the dragons in this case, that are like Navarre. Navarre's want to find their own kind as well, which is an important plot point later on. As well as preparing for readiness and learning to trust allies that you've not got along with for centuries as a big cataclysm approaches. This is fairly standard fantasy fare. The quest to go and find the thing to save the day is very, very much Fantasy 101. But overall, it is Fantasy 101 for a reason. It is a setup that works against a backdrop of a ticking clock of an impending army of doom to wipe everybody out. So the actual story itself does work pretty well as a narrative framing. The dragons steal the show in this once again. 10 is a level of self-confident bulldozer on wings with a sardonic wit and consistent snark, which I really appreciate, and I do like characters like that in general in fantasy. But as the flip side of that, Navarre, who is kind of self-assured in a different way, in that youthful arrogance way before you get knocked back a few steps. But then, when these knockbacks happen, you see Navarre beginning to struggle with the repercussions and revelations of what's going on as hope begins to dim at times, or they find out more and more stuff, or rejection happens. And it's really interesting to watch because this is not a situation that is particularly good for the mental health of anyone, let alone an adolescent, which realistically Navarre still is. Still very new to the world, not fully grown, cannot emotionally process stuff. And you do get that level of frustration bleeding through at the people around them. But there are certain moments in here where you still have that level of sort of joyful exuberance at something new that's not been seen before, which you can't help but smile at. But the other thing worth mentioning here is that the side characters really come to the fore here, especially with their dragons, because we do begin to see more of the interaction between other dragons and their riders here, and get more of an idea of how different the bonds can look and how different those dragon rider relationships can look as well, compared to Violet and Tern, or to Xaden and Sorrengail. And speaking of the side cast, the human characters as well are kind of the highlight for me. Specifically, Riddick is absolutely amazing. Love Riddick so much. Everyone needs a friend like Riddick. But Imogen, Quinn, Sawyer, Rhiannon, Sloane, and even Arik, who isn't in it a huge amount, but when they do come in, and with their position as second in line to the throne potentially, they all add a level of depth which has kind of been lacking a little bit in the series so far, because it gives you a slightly wider sort of perspective, and they're not afraid to speak up against these two incredibly powerful people in Xaden in terms of physical and political and magical power, and Violet as well. As for Xaden, of the two mains, actually has the more interesting sort of arc for me personally, as it's in many ways still a continuation of the Control arc. After being turned venom at the end of the last book, the self-realization that he's potentially going to be a monster, but using that to his advantage to help protect the people that he loves, is very much on brand for Xaden's character in general. But also the fear of hurting those around him. And this is a very consistent arc that has flown through all the books. And the keeping Violet at arm's length actually in this case makes sense, whereas at other times in the previous books it did feel forced, which I really appreciate. And actually I find myself liking Xaden a lot more, and I like Xaden's character in general. I like Xaden a lot more after this book than I did after Iron Flame. Which fetches me to Violet. Violet has a really interesting character arc, but I was beginning to dislike her by the end of Iron Flame. I really disliked her at the start of this. As her arc progressed, I began to dislike her less, but there's a few things that are beginning to creep in consistently with her character that I don't like. Starting with the relationship with Xaden, it feels more like a situationship than a relationship at times. It's far more lustful than romantic, and you can kind of hand wave that away a little bit because of the age of the characters and the situation that they're in. But anytime, pretty much throughout the majority of the book, that she's talking or thinking about him, it's almost always in terms of where he can put parts of himself, and it bores me in the nicest possible way. It is not as prevalent in here as it was in Iron Flame, which is better, but kind of over that by this point. But she does have a really interesting arc, because so far she's somehow gotten away with everything that she's done, be it by hook, crook, or luck. And this time round, she doesn't. And you see this very early on, where she's trying to maneuver the people around her, and they just turn around and go, well, if you don't want to do that, then we're just not doing it then, are we? And she just gets full stopped. And this becomes a case of her beginning to realise that while she may be the main character of this story, the main character syndrome that she's had in books 1 and 2 begins to lessen. And you have this arc of them realising that they can't do everything themselves. They can't save everyone. They have to rely on other people, and sometimes you have to accept that you are not going to get what you want. And that is a really, really good arc for her to go on, because it makes her less frustrating. The biggest frustration with her, though, is to do with how smart she's meant to be, because there are several times in here, and you can say this relatively safely because this is told from her point of view through the majority of the book, that there's certain things going on and she doesn't click on the obvious thing. And this isn't necessarily just in the moment, because you can put that down to battle stress or just stress within the moment, but there's certain things that happen that are really obviously played out on the page. For example, some stuff to do with Arik, where you go, oh, that's what that is, and Violet doesn't realise until far too far in the book to what she should have done. And that's a bit frustrating for a character that has been built up as being intelligence, evidence-driven, originally trained as a scribe, so follows the trail of information. And that is a little bit frustrating to see. But overall, she did have a really solid arc. So in summary, don't particularly like Violet still, but like her more than I did at the start of the book. I want more time with the supporting cast. I want more time with the dragons. I am curious to see where Xaden goes as well after the ending of this. The world building here is pretty good on a surface level. The book begins in Basgiath, board of Basgiath now. We know about as much as we need to know about that place. This really picks up once Basgiath is left behind and they go off on the quest looking for Andana's kind, and they're going to various different places that we have not visited before in the series. We've only had mention of. And as they go to these various places, you get this idea of these different cultures. They all feel very different. They worship in different ways. Their traditions are different. Their approach to life in general is kind of the polar opposite, almost more hopeful in many ways than the way Navarre feels. And I kind of wanted more time in those areas. I would have been quite happy if this book had just gone, we're in Basgiath, oh, and now we're on a quest, and then spend more time fleshing out the places that they go, because that was the highlight of the book for me. It did enough, and I understand why they spent so little time in these areas, because you do have the ticking clock going on at the back. But that part of the world building was the most interesting to me. Now, the other side of this is the politics, and you can't really get into this by leaving Basgiath too early, in Navarre as well. But you have the interaction of Navarre, who has always been kind of the superpower in many ways on the continent, and their new relationships with the neighbouring countries and provinces, and the stresses and strains of new alliances, sharing information, sharing resources, and the sort of the difficulty of integration of long-term enemies having to work together against a common foe. I like that. I like the fact that everyone's not just friends straight away. You still have this undercurrent of distrust that occasionally does turn violent, as you know, these people have been fighting each other for a long time. We also get more stuff about how magic works in the world, and magic isn't everywhere, which is an interesting wrinkle, which I'm curious to see how that gets developed, because that feels really, really important. But there's talk in here of the balance of magic, how the scales need to stay relatively balanced, but once every century or so, there's a way to tip the balance one side or the other. That's an interesting concept, which again has been explored in other fantasy books before, but it's an interesting little wrinkle to add in here, considering you have almost like a living and a soulless sort of idea here. Speaking of souls, the idea of the Venom not having a soul anymore, that being the whole driver for what they are, and the cost of their power, is actually a really interesting one, and that quite curiously links into the expansion of information on the religions of the world as well. The other thing that worth mentioning here, and I didn't twig on this at first, is we still have the idea of rewritten history in here, but it's incredibly subtle the way it's presented. Because as we go to these other places, we realise that everyone in Navarre and on the continent in general refers to it as the continent. Well, there's more than one continent in the world. Nobody else refers to it as the continent, and as you begin to dig, you realise that this was just one area that used to have a different name, and as the histories were rewritten, things got renamed. Feels a bit like what's going on with the Gulf of Mexico right now, if you really think about it. Relevant politics reference there. But I find it quite interesting that there's a lot of world building elements again being thrown in here, and not stuff you haven't seen elsewhere. It just lacked a little bit of depth. It does enough, and again, you have a ticking clock. You can't really spend too much time in any specific area because of what they're doing, and you don't want it to become too exposition heavy. So it's probably the best balanced it could be. I kind of want to know more. The world building here is pretty good on a surface level. The book begins in Basgiath, board of Basgiath now. We know about as much as we need to know about that place. This really picks up once Basgiath is left behind and they go off on the quest looking for Andana's kind, and they're going to various different places that we have not visited before in the series. We've only had mention of. And as they go to these various places, you get this idea of these different cultures. They all feel very different. They worship in different ways. Their traditions are different. Their approach to life in general is kind of the polar opposite, almost more hopeful in many ways than the way Navarre feels. And I kind of wanted more time in those areas. I would have been quite happy if this book had just gone, we're in Basgiath. Oh, and now we're on a quest, and then spend more time fleshing out the places that they go, because that was the highlight of the book for me. It did enough, and I understand why they spent so little time in these areas, because you do have the ticking clock going on at the back. But that part of the world building was the most interesting to me. Now, the other side of this is the politics, and you can't really get into this by leaving Basgiath too early in Navarre as well. But you have the interaction of Navarre, who has always been kind of the superpower in many ways on the continent, and their new relationships with the neighbouring countries and provinces, and the stresses and strains of new alliances, sharing information, sharing resources, and the sort of the difficulty of integration of long-term enemies having to work together against a common foe. I like that. I like the fact that everyone's not just friends straight away. You still have this undercurrent of distrust that occasionally does turn violent, as these people have been fighting each other for a long time. We also get more stuff about how magic works in the world, and magic isn't everywhere, which is an interesting wrinkle, which I'm curious to see how that gets developed, because that feels really, really important. But there's talk in here of the balance of magic, how the scales need to stay relatively balanced, but once every century or so, there's a way to tip the balance one side or the other. That's an interesting concept, which again has been explored in other fantasy books before, but it's an interesting little wrinkle to add in here, considering you have almost like a living and a soulless sort of idea here. Speaking of souls, the idea of the Venom not having a soul anymore, that being the whole driver for what they are, and the cost of their power, is actually a really interesting one, and that quite curiously links into the expansion of information on the religions of the world as well. The other thing that worth mentioning here, and I didn't twig on this at first, is we still have the idea of rewritten history in here, but it's incredibly subtle the way it's presented. Because as we go to these other places, we realise that everyone in Navarre, on the continent in general, refers to it as the continent. Well, there's more than one continent in the world. Nobody else refers to it as the continent, and as you begin to dig, you realise that this was just one area that used to have a different name, and as the histories were rewritten, things got renamed. Feels a bit like what's going on with the Gulf of Mexico right now, if you really think about it. Relevant politics reference there. But I find it quite interesting that there's a lot of world building elements again being thrown in here, and not stuff you haven't seen elsewhere. It just lacked a little bit of depth. It does enough, and again, you have a ticking clock. You can't really spend too much time in any specific area because of what they're doing, and you don't want it to become too exposition heavy. So it's probably the best balanced it could be. I kind of want to know more. I'm giving this a 4 stars. I think this is good. I think this is a good continuation of the story. It is not perfect. There's a lot to like here. I like the expanded world. It opened up a load of new questions about how certain things work. You have revelations. You have evolving storylines. The dragons are amazing. The side cast, when the spotlight is on them, feel absolutely stronger in this than the other books as well. And there's some choices made later on, which I'll touch on in a minute, which really do reinforce that and make me hopeful for the series going forward. But there were two things that really held this back for me from getting really, really good. Three things. One is how shallow the world building is. Now, that is by necessity. This is more plot driven than world driven. And as a result of this, because of the ticking time clock, you cannot spend too much time in one place. So you cannot dive into those areas as much as I would like to. That's a necessitation of the plot. I understand why that is as it is. Just takes a little bit away from me because they're the bits of the book I enjoyed the most. The next thing was the start. I am bored of Violet goes up against person of power who is just a dick. Bored of it. We've had it in book 1, 2, and 3 now. General Atos wanted him off the page and not in a good way. We've already seen this dynamic with other characters. It's just same character, different name. Or that's how it felt like. And whilst it did start to cause the shift in Violet's character to realizing that she can't do everything herself, and she can't always bulldoze her opponents, which is a slight difference to the way the relationships worked in the previous books. I'm still bored of seeing that, and it made the first part of the book a slog. And just like Iron Flame, the start of this book is a slog, although it does not overstay its welcome to anywhere near the extent that it did in book 2. The other thing, however, is to do with the relationship between Violet and Xaden. And overall, their relationship develops quite well. It loses some of the toxic traits. The problem I have is whenever we're in Violet's head and she's thinking about Xaden, because it's almost never in a romantic sense. There are romantic moments. They are far better when we hit those. But it's almost always in a lustful sense of the physicality of him, what he looks like, what he feels like, what it feels like when they're doing stuff to each other. And I get that that's a selling point for Romancy and that it's a selling point for this series in general. But we've been there, we've done that, and unfortunately it's left me to a point now where I am slightly uninvested in their relationship. I think they should split up. We should follow more interesting characters than Violet, because I don't think Violet's particularly interesting, even if she does have a vaguely compelling character arc. But it meant that when we got to the spicy scenes, and there are spicy scenes in here, I can't remember any of them. Nothing. I remember nothing about the spicy scenes in this book. And they weren't badly written. I don't remember thinking, when I was listening to it, thinking, this is crap. They were fine. But they don't stick in my head like the first scene in Fourth Wing when they first got together, or the scene on the throne in Iron Flame. It doesn't have that wow factor, that sparkle in those scenes that those two books had. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when you have this constant forcing of how gorgeous somebody is, you expect those moments, the chemistry, to blow it off the page, and it does not. Although there is the added point here of you do have more restraint from the characters because of what they're going through. So you can again explain it away. But overall, the dragons are the highlight, the side characters are the highlight, and I like the world building. Violet I have cooled on a great deal. But that's it for the main part of the review. If you are leaving me here, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and if you've enjoyed the Empyrean series, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm going to dive into a few spoilers now. So, spoilers and a bit of speculation here, because we're going to touch on the ending of the book. There's a few things that I really want to know, because there's a few things that have not been particularly well fleshed out, or outright not mentioned so far, and I think they're linked, but I'm not sure how yet. Specifically around the dragons, the gods, and magic. Because we barely touched on the Imperium in the last book, and the only real mention we've had of it in here is the fact that the Irids, which is Andana's species of dragon, left. And the idea of them leaving appears to be because they were pacifistic and did not believe in the war that was going on and being used for battle. And this really comes through with their opinion of what Andana has become under the tutelage of Tern, and their bonding with Violet, and their approach and their attitude to conflict in general. You sense disgust and an abhorrence from the other Irids towards Andana because of how they are, and see Andana as needing to be fixed. That's interesting, because that is the polar opposite of the way that the Imperium is, and it makes you wonder what caused that, what was the catalyst for that change, because it feels like the Venom are this all-encompassing threat, devouring magic and a threat to Dragonkind. So you'd think Dragonkind would want to fight this to prevent their own extinction. That doesn't quite make sense here. And the other thing is, there's a consistent mention of magic being a balance. The Venom are obviously sucking magic out of the world. It feels like the Irids may be the other side of the balance, because they refer to themselves as purely magical beings in a way that the other dragons are not. There are things that the Irids can do that other dragons don't appear to be able to do, and whilst the other dragons are reliant on magic to exist, it feels like the Irids are something slightly different. And the third thing here is the gods. And the gods have been touched on multiple times throughout the series, and they become more prevalent in here because of stuff around both Xaden and Violet, as well as the various places that they visit. And it makes me think that the gods, the dragons, the venom, and the magic system all are forming four corners of something, which may be alluded to on the cover. I'm not quite sure exactly what that interaction looks like yet, but I have a feeling that there is a lot closer relationship between the dragons, the gods, and the venom that we've been led to believe up to this point. It feels like this might be a writing of the balance in some way, or an attempt to write the balance that got out of control. Quite often in fantasy, you do see the character archetype of somebody who ascends to godhood through greed and want for power, and that very much does feel like what the venom are. So, curious for that. Well, the other thing is the ending to this, because I've seen a lot of confusion online about the ending, and I think the ending is really, really interesting and potentially game-changing in a way that the other two endings were not. And the other two endings were blockbuster endings. But to have a major life event happen involving your two main characters, to then disappear one of those main characters, and delete the memory of the other of what has happened, that's a really brave and interesting choice. I'm curious to see what sort of storytelling that's going to facilitate going forward, especially when you consider that we got two other POV chapters in here. We got one for Imogen and one for Rhiannon. And part of me is hopeful that we're going to have a bit of a step back from Violet in the next book, and we're going to have other characters that step forward and take the sort of the impetus. And I don't know if that's going to be the case. I can't see it being entirely so. I would be very curious to see if we have a book without Xaden in it in the next one, and instead we go to a dual point of view between Violet and one of the side characters. And actually, I'm here for that, and in fact, I'm even more here for that if instead of having Violet as the main POV character, you share it between Imogen and Rhiannon, and have Violet and Xaden as secondary point of views at the end of the book as revelations come out, and it's kind of an outsider looking in. That, I think, would be really, really interesting and help build this world even more. Now, whether that happens, I'm a little bit doubtful due to the fact that this is a romance. The focus so far has very much been Violet and Xaden. But if you're to look at this through a pure fantasy lens, it's a fascinating idea to consider. But if you've watched this bit, I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I'll catch you all soon.